Welcome. This is History Theory, and today we discuss what if George Washington hadn't existed? But before we think about what might have happened, we have to think about what really happened. George Washington was a British and later American military leader, politician, and idealist in the latter half of the 1700s, best known for being a major founding father for the United States of America. His career began as a British soldier in the colony of Virginia, one of Britain's most prosperous colonies in North America at the time. He served in the French and Indian War, which was part of the 7 Years' War, on the side of Britain as the two sides fought over control of the Ohio River. And although he did not see the war through to the end, it gave him valuable experiences and skills which would come in handy throughout his life. George Washington held disdain for British mercantilism and their system of controlling governance over their colonies. Mercantilism, for those of you who don't know, is an economic system in which colonies of a nation are only permitted to trade with the mother country, bringing further profits to the mother country and far less profit for the colonies themselves. Britain used this system, along with many other nations, with its colonies in the Americas, making Britain wealthy and leaving the colonists who exported the resources less so. George Washington also opposed the taxes Britain set in place to cover the costs of the 7 Years' War, which heavily taxed the American colonists and gave only further profit to Britain. The breaking point, however, was when the British Parliament declared that colonial law could be overridden by British laws at any time. Washington led widespread protests against these and other elements of British rule across the colonies and started a campaign for colonial independence from Britain. Violence seemed inevitable, and in 1775, the War of Independence, or the American Revolutionary War, broke out. It was local militias and others who supported the revolution against the might of the British Empire. George Washington, however, became the commander-in-chief of the newly established Continental Army fighting to free the colonies from British rule. The battles were harsh, and it wasn't easy, but eventually the American colonies defeated the British with the help of French aid. George Washington, as the primary leader and inspirational figure in the War of Independence, declined the position of king and became the first president of the United States. As of the newly written U.S. Constitution, George Washington was only president for 8 years before stepping down from power. His bravery, determination, and humility helped create the United States as we know it and shape it into what it is today. But what if George Washington hadn't been there when he was needed most? What if George Washington had never existed to begin with? As Washington had been a leading figure in the French and Indian War, it is possible that France may have gained control of the Ohio River Valley and perhaps much more territory in North America. As the French were much more popular among and much more kind and diplomatic with Native American and First Nation peoples, Native Americans might have prospered much more under French rule than they did under British and American jurisdiction. If France had won the 7 Years' War in North America, early French colonialism would not have been as short-lived as it was in real life. Perhaps France might have been much more of a world power in the 18th and 19th centuries than it was. The United States as we know it would not have been created. Without George Washington's leadership skills, both in battle and in politics, the British Empire may have easily put a stop to the rebellion in its American colonies. British control of the Atlantic in North America would remain as strong as it had been previously, and British markets would have continued to profit from American tobacco and other resources. The patriotic, almost warmongerish aspect of American culture would not have been formed. The history of North America, and the history of the world, might have looked very different. An often overlooked aspect of the American Revolution is that it was the first of many revolutions that occurred around the globe in the century afterward. The French Revolution was inspired much in part by the American Revolution that had just happened right across the Atlantic. Ironically, Louis XVI's decision to help the American colonies in the American Revolution helped lead to his own beheading at the hands of the guillotine as revolutionary zeal began to spread throughout the world. And it wasn't only the French Revolution that was inspired by what happened in the American. Revolutions such as the ones in Haiti, Mexico, and other Latin American nations fought for their own independence, taking on the examples of others who had done so. And although the American Revolution had been much more about economics and politics than idealism, the concept of revolutions around the world began to make advances to the concept of human rights and similar ideologies. George Washington inevitably and indirectly helped reform and overthrow many governments other than his own. However, the United States was, and still is, a double-edged sword. Despite inspiring humanistic ideals and so forth, many aspects of the nation George Washington helped create aren't so great. The United States has a long history of brutal slavery and racism, which George Washington both acknowledged and upheld. And even though he supported the abolition of slavery in his old age, and the United States didn't abolish slavery until 1863, and its scars and repercussions still have a massive impact on the modern day. Britain, on the other hand, abolished slavery peacefully in the year 1807, more than half a century earlier. In addition to that, the United States' relationship with Native Americans hasn't exactly been pretty either. Over the course of American history, the United States has actively conquered almost all native land and has attempted to destroy the Native American way of life in many different instances. If George Washington had not created the United States, perhaps a different and more favorable fate would have befallen Native Americans in these areas. And to be clear, I'm not saying the United States wouldn't have existed if George Washington hadn't, but it would have been a very different United States. The closest example is Canada, which remained a British colony until it peacefully achieved its own independence in 1867. Without a George Washington-led revolution, perhaps the United States would be more tame and have less of that wild, patriotic zeal that is so often associated with Americans even today. Mexico would likely be a much stronger and larger nation, especially as Spanish power in the Americas would have remained strong, and Mexico, once it declared independence of its own, would inherit that power. After all, Mexico controlled much more territory than it does today until the United States conquered half of it in the Mexican-American War. Spanish and Mexican influence and culture in places like California would be much stronger than it already is. Mexico might have become much more of an economic and productive powerhouse itself. On a similar note, Alaska would probably still be under Russian control, and Russian cultural influence there would have been more significant as well. The United States would have been much less economically and politically powerful, and likely would have not had the production or military might to intervene in either World War I or World War II, if either one of those had still occurred in this alternate timeline. Who knows, perhaps the situation in Europe would have been much different without rising colonial independence movements and American nationalism. Advancements in technology and sciences might not have happened as they did, or happened at a much contrasting pace. Who knows if Silicon Valley would have gotten a good hold, or had an equivalent somewhere else in the world. The modern face of technological advancement could have been completely different. Without George Washington and the nation he helped create, it's not clear whether the world as a whole would be better or worse off, but we do know that it would be vastly different. This has been History Theory. Subscribe for more content, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.